Good morning, traders. This is John with the Stock Strategy Circle, and it is September 19th of 2024, and the general market is up. As I said before in some other videos, the number one driver for the stock market, at least in my lifetime, and I was born in 1973, has been inflation. And it's my view that if you don't hold stocks, that you're going to get clobbered in the coming hyperinflation, which is still coming. Current interest rates are historically low. And when I mean historically low, I'm talking about all the way back to the Roman Empire. There has never been a time in history where interest rates have been this cheap. It's not interest rates that cause inflation. This is a myth that is widely perpetrated by the financial media. It's not the Fed that creates inflation. That is also a myth that is widely perpetrated by the financial media. The Fed enables inflation, but they don't create it. It's not low interest rates that create inflation. I might do a whole video explaining that, but probably I won't. Just hear me out for now. Inflation always and everywhere throughout history, and we're talking all the way back as far as there has been money, has been caused by governments overspending and running up debts that they do not pay off. The reason why private loans and interest rates don't create inflation is because if you borrow money, regardless of the interest rate, you have to pay it off. Therefore, when the money is created to give you a loan in fractional reserve banking, two things are created at the same time, an asset and a liability. They net each other out. The reason it's different with governments is because governments never repay their debts. There hasn't been a government in history that has repaid its debts. The worst possible person you could loan money to, if it was a person, would be your government. This has been true for thousands of years. You find this same activity going on in the Chinese dynasties. The one I know the most about is the Roman Empire. They had no central bank. They had no paper currency. And they still had massive inflations that wiped out their own economy and destroyed people's lives. Why? Well, because they ran up debts they wouldn't repay, because they stepped on the currency. They mixed in base metal with gold coins, and that was how they drove inflation. When the US was on a gold standard, there was sort of a control as to the amount of debt the government was able to run up. When we went off the gold standard, that was no longer the case. The stagflation that took place in the 70s was caused by irrational deficit spending in order to finance the Vietnam War. That inflation magically went away in the 80s, not because of anything Paul Volcker did. That is all nonsense. The war stopped. That's what happened. When we got into the Clinton era, where they said Alan Greenspan was a genius because he engineered the economy, we went into a time period where there was very little inflation, and in some cases there was even deflation. That wasn't caused by the Fed either. Alan Greenspan, even though he didn't lower rates as low as they are now, did have historically low rates. What caused the lack of inflation through the Clinton years was when the federal government balanced its budget. Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton got government spending in line, and it stayed in line for a few years. The economy did okay until around 2003. And then in 2003, we completely went off the tracks. All GDP growth since 2003 in the United States has been fueled by government spending. The economy is not actually getting any bigger. The numbers you see are all prompted by wasteful government spending. It's all been inflation. Now, how do I know that? If you go to the Federal Reserve's website, it's called FRED, F-R-E-D. You can look up U.S. industrial production, and you'll see that for the most part, it hasn't gone up since 2003. So how is it that U.S. industrial production isn't rising, but GDP keeps going up? Well, that's the trick in GDP. What they do in order to trick you into thinking things are going well when in reality they're not, is they take government spending and they add it in. And that's what GDP is. GDP is a measurement of actual economic productivity added into government wasteful spending. Now, in your own life, you wouldn't do this. Nobody would think that a person's productivity is going up because they've run themselves into debt and have a looming bankruptcy on their horizon. That just makes no sense at all. And yet all of the economists, and I mean all of them, I don't know a single economist who would tell you what I'm about to tell you, believe that somehow if you have rising GDP, which includes the fact that your government is headed into bankruptcy, that somehow that's a good thing. If you were to look at your own finances, you could determine if you were being productive or not by figuring out how much actual money you're bringing home. Nobody would say that they had a great year because they borrowed $1 million and spent it. That's absolutely insane. Government spending, if you want to know what's really going on in an economy, government spending should be counted as an expense, not as an asset. Why? The purpose of government is to provide security for a nation. It's literally an expense. You can think of your government in reality, not what they tell you it is, but in reality, what your government is supposed to be doing is it's supposed to be a security guard for the country. That's why it has a military. That's why it puts up borders. That's why you have a navy. None of that stuff is economically productive. If you have an alarm system on your home and every month you're paying $100 to monitor that system, that's not an asset. You don't add that into your asset column on your balance sheet. That is a reoccurring expense. Government is a reoccurring expense. And so the real way to figure out what's going on in an economy, and this is true for all economies, would be to take the total industrial production and then subtract government spending from it, because government spending is an operating expense. It's not an asset. If you were to do that with the United States, you would see that the true United States economy is shrinking and has been shrinking for years. And that's the real reason why everything seems like it sucks right now, unless you're an illegal alien who's getting free government money. You have to stop listening to the financial news. You have to stop listening to these politicians. They're all lying to you. Literally nothing they say makes sense, and it's all being done on purpose. Stop looking for these people to give you answers, because they're outright lying. The next question is, why do they do it? What is the reason why that the financial media and all of the financial pundits and even people who I have tremendous respect for blame the Fed for what's going on? Because the Fed was engineered by politicians to be a whipping boy so the public does not get aware of what's actually going on. And that's it. Congress blames the Fed when Congress knows why there's inflation. It has nothing to do with the Fed. It's congressional spending that causes the inflation. It's laws that Congress passes that causes the inflation. Most of you probably don't even know, but all of the banks pretty much in the world are capitalized by government debt. And that means there are laws in place that force these banks to buy government debt in order to claim that they're solvent. That makes no sense at all. Why? Because governments don't pay back their debts. It should be the opposite. Any balance sheet that's holding government debt, that should be subtracted from the bank's Tier 1 capital. Governments are non-productive. Governments go on the expense side of the balance sheet. So why you would fund your whole banking system with something that is an expense is just totally insane. But they're able to get away with it because most of you don't spend any time thinking about what's really going on. How should banks be funded or capitalized? Banks should be capitalized with deposits, with stocks, with bonds and private corporations, and mostly with mortgages on private real estate. There should be a law passed that doesn't allow banks to purchase government loans. Banks should not be allowed to own treasuries. If banks weren't allowed to own treasuries of any kind, whether they're U.S. treasuries or Bundesbonds or whatever, there wouldn't be any government debt because nobody would buy the government debt, because anybody with any common sense knows governments don't pay back their debts. So the whole system is rigged against us in the favor of the people who are in power, and you have to wake up and realize what is going on. Because if you don't, you're all going to end up serfs on the land that you think you own.